I personally believe Resident Evil 4 Remake sets up the story so that we might be able to see Luis again in the series. Now, many of you are probably asking, well, how is that? Luis is dead. How is he going to show up again? Well, I'm not talking about the events after Resident Evil 4. I'm talking about events that take place before Resident Evil 4. Now, as many of you guys are aware, if you played Resident Evil 4 Remake, one of the things that they added that was, I thought was a great addition that honestly made things more cohesive in the Resident Evil lore was the fact that they made Luis an ex-employee of Umbrella. So in the island section of the game, you can find a picture of Luis in his old days when he was an employee of Umbrella. Now, there's a couple of things to note in this photograph. For starters, it specifically states that it's the European Laboratory 6 Dream Team. Now, what we can ascertain from this picture is that this was probably Umbrella's youngest and most brightest scientist. So this is why they would probably give the name Dream Team. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's another game that takes place in an Umbrella research facility in Europe. That game specifically being Resident Evil Code Veronica. So in the intro of Resident Evil Code Veronica, the game takes place in the Paris facility. Now, this is where my theory comes into play here, is that if they were to make a Resident Evil Code Veronica remake game, it would be really cool, for starters, if we had like an initial sequence, that the first sequence in in the Paris facility, if we actually got to play a little in that section. So it wasn't just a full cutscene that kind of skips to the island section of the game, but in reality, if we got to play a little in the Paris facility. But what would be really interesting here is that what if we saw the Dream Team? What if Europe Laboratory 6 Dream Team was actually located in Paris? What if in the introduction of Code Veronica, what if we encounter or see a glimpse of Luis working in the facility? I honestly think that this would be a really cool detail to add, Luis working on a project in the Paris facility. And just so you guys know, I stream every single Saturday, and I just started streaming on Twitch. And as many of you guys are aware, there's also another guy on Twitch that recently changed his name. He tried to steal my name, Project Wesker. I actually had a word with him, and he did admit this. He's like, oh yeah, I knew that you existed, but I decided to change my name. He has no plans on changing his name, so it'd be much appreciated if you guys could go give me a follow on Twitch. Now, another thing that also supports my theory is that if we look at Resident Evil 3 Remake, there were some changes to the lore as well. Now, as many of you guys know, that once you reach the nest area in Resident Evil 3 Remake, there's a section in the laboratory that you can find a file that specifically references that there was a European Umbrella research lab that came up with the idea of the NEA parasite. So I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that this Dream Team that takes place in Europe was the same European research lab that was mentioned in Resident Evil 3 Remake, which in turn would make Luis Serra actually the guy that came up with the Nemesis parasite, the NEA parasite for Nemesis. That would be super wild to see that Luis was the one that was working on the Nemesis project. Now, I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that Luis worked on the NEA parasite, because again, we do have to remember that Luis did grow up in the village that would later be infected with Las Plagas again, and his ancestors, in turn, the people that used to live in the village, were infected with the parasite, centuries ago, if we look at the lore of Resident Evil 4. And if anything, I wouldn't be surprised if he was aware of Las Plagas. Now, we do know in the lore of Resident Evil 4 that, Sadler came in with a bunch of people and showed up, and then the whole castle was kind of active, and they had those Las Plagas flags, and the villagers were like, what? Now, it is worth mentioning that we don't know exactly when Los Iluminados showed up into that Spanish area, right? We don't know exactly the dates, but I'm assuming it's probably after Luis left the village and became a scientist or whatever. Again, I would have liked it if we got a little more lore on that. But if anything, my theory at the end of the day is that it would be really interesting to be able to see Luis again in Resident Evil Code Veronica Remake. And as mentioned before, I think it would be really cool if there was like a tutorial section at the intro of Resident Evil Code Veronica that takes place in Umbrella Paris facility. What if there's a small outbreak that occurs, and as Claire is running through the hallways, she encounters Luis or whatever, and she kind of has a chat with Luis that kind of changes his mind, so that then he kind of reflects and is like, wait a second, this is not a good company to work for. But I think it would be really cool if, as Claire's running through the hallways or whatever, escaping the facility, it would be really interesting to see if she, encounters and has a chat with Luis. What if she talks with Luis and figures out that, he's working on the project, he's working on other stuff for Umbrella, and we could kind of have like a small cutscene, like a small cameo of Luis. I'm not asking for much in my theory, you know what I mean? But I'm saying is that there's definitely potential to see Luis again. Now, if you guys enjoyed my theory, then make sure to click this video for 25 secret details you might have missed in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.